Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 30. Today in the podcast, we're hearing from 6 whitetail experts on their ideal rut hunting setup. Enjoy. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. Today is actually a bonus mini episode of the podcast, but since it's early November and the whitetail rut is on, we're pulling out all the stops to keep you well informed and ready for big bucks. So there will be 2 episodes this week. How about that? That said, today we're actually going to be sharing with you an exclusive sneak peek at our Rules of the Rut 2.0 podcast series. As you've probably heard about already, earlier this year I launched the Rules of the Rut 2.0, a digital product package comprised of 2 ebooks and 3 podcasts featuring some of the top whitetail hunters in the country, covering all things related to the rut. Today, I wanted to share with you an excerpt from the second podcast in that series, in which we discuss rut hunting stand sites. For this section, I asked 6 incredible whitetail hunters to describe their ideal rut hunting setup in detail. In this section, you'll hear from Bernie Barringer, Scott Bestul, Randy Hines, Don Higgins, Jeffster, and Dan Infalt. If you like what you hear, be sure to visit wiredtohunt.com/rulesoftherut to download the full package with the 2 ebooks and 3 podcasts, jam-packed with more great rut hunting information. That all said, let's dive right into our excerpt from the Rules of the Rut 2.0 podcast series, Part 2. Welcome back to the Rules of the Rut podcast series. This is Part 2. To this point, we've talked about the timing of the rut, characteristics of the various phases of the rut, and deer behavior at this time of year. Now, many have said that hunting during the rut is as simple as hunting long hours and hoping for a big buck to eventually waltz by. And while of course long hours in the stand are important, that's not everything. As they say, it's about being in the right place at the right time. With that said, in this podcast episode, we're going to be focused on tree stand placement and setup philosophies for the rut. In short, everything you need to know to make sure you are in the right place when that buck of your dreams comes moving through. To begin this section, we asked several of our whitetail experts what their ideal rut hunting setup would look like. Their answers are loaded with wisdom that you can apply during your own hunts. So get out a piece of paper and get ready to take notes. To kick things off, here's Bernie Barringer, an accomplished outdoor writer, the author of The Freelance Bowhunter, and a blogger at bowhuntingroad.com.
I think my perfect rut stand would be in a pinch point that is leading between bedding areas. Bucks know where the does bed, and they tend to just rotate back and forth, and they travel a lot. They're on their feet during the day, during the peak of the rut, and so that pinch point would be something that funnels down those deer into a narrow area where there's a tree that you can get in and have the wind right, and just be in a situation where your odds are high of having one of those deer that are on their feet come by you. And a lot of people would prefer to be in areas where there's just doe concentrations or where the does are feeding or whatever. But I think during the peak of the rut, it's better to actually be in a travel zone that actually narrows down the travel pattern. Like it might be an outside bend of a river that's more difficult for them to cross, so it narrows down the pathway along the top of a ridge or the bottom of the ridge below by the river, or it might be some wide, long-running barriers with open areas on both sides that would pinch these deer down. And so if you can find bedding areas where the deer are bedding and get on something between them, that's probably your best situation. And when I'm looking for this site, I'm going to think high and think low, I guess is the way I put it. I'm going to look at the ridge tops, or I'm going to look at a creek bottom or something like that. That's where the deer tend to prefer to travel, and that can be based on the wind direction. And if you're on a ridge top, it's especially good because you have wind that's coming up the ridge and carrying your scent up and away from the ground. So you can hunt 360 a little bit better than you can down in a bottom.
Next, we've got Randy Hines, outdoor writer and blogger at 365whitetail.com.
Ideal stand site would be in between where I know that a buck is going to be, or I should say, where I know a buck is most likely to be cruising for does. These are going to be a lot of funnels, and I hunt a lot of funnels during the rut. Like last year, we hunt this little strip of property that no one wants to hunt there, but I know that on the other side of it is a piece of private property no one can hunt. It's very thick. So during the actual, if you want to call it the hunter's rut, I think as the doters call it, or you want to call it the chase phase, the does go to that spot because it's very thick and they're trying to hide from the bucks. During, that phase of the rut, these bucks are still cruising from a large portion of timber through that funnel into where those does are. Now, the does obviously want nothing to do with them, but that's where I would say would be a premier stand spot, or where I would want to have a stand.
Continuing on, here's Scott Bestul again of Field and Stream with his take on the ideal rut hunting stand.
I'm a big terrain hunter. I see whitetail deer hunting a lot like fishing, for trout or bass. And, you look at a lake or a river, and you're looking at structure and water flow, and and you're asking yourself, okay, if I was a fish, where would I be laying? And if I was a really big fish that was kind of picky about where he sat and waited for food or breathing or whatever he's going to do, where would I be? And I'm a lot the same way with deer. I try to read terrain, figure out how deer, especially bucks, are going to move through terrain. I think they do it a little more discreetly than does, and they also do it a little more lazily. A doe will cut out and run to point B from point A, at the most, I guess, obvious point. A lot of times bucks don't do that. They prefer to be hidden, but they always seem to have these kind of covert travel that help them, cover the distance efficiently. So anyway, I'm a big terrain hunter. I like to sit in funnels, and especially kind of addendum to that, funnels close to whatever the hot food source is right now, especially that, you refer to the early November time frame. I think, does drive the rut. I mean, where the does are is where it's going to happen. And so you have to know what those does are feeding on. So I'm looking for a terrain funnel near the best food source that's hold the most does.
Next, we've got Don Higgins again, as he shares his own thoughts on the perfect spot to be during the rut.
Well, during the early phases of the rut, I like to be on the downwind edge of thick bedding cover. And those bucks, just for one thing, a mature buck is always going to use his nose. And if you're on the downwind edge of that bedding cover, that is the perfect place for a buck to cruise through. He can smell that cover for a hot doe, but he can also detect any danger, any hunters that might be in that cover. So if you're right on the edge, you can position yourself where he cannot smell you, but yet he can still do what he wants to do by smelling that cover. And actually, when I do seminars, I've got a video clip that I show of how bucks use the wind. And there's one part of that clip where I'm sitting the edge of a thicket in the early rut, and in one morning, I think I had 8 or 10 bucks cruise that edge of the thicket, and every one of them was doing the same thing, using the wind to check that cover. And that's something that my ideal stand site's right on the downwind edge of that good bedding cover.
Jeff Sturgis also chimed in on this topic, and he had a very specific situation in mind.
Yes, I can. I love I love to hunt early season near food sources, water holes. I love to hunt the late season food source, muzzleloader and bow. But boy, my favorite time to hunt in the woods is that last week of October, first week of November, when you get those really good cold fronts that come through. And again, you have these temperatures, and it's all relative. It really doesn't matter if the high temperatures have been in the low 50s or the mid 70s. When you get that 15, 20 degree temperature drop and you get that rising barometric pressure, you have calm, cold, clear skies. I love to go in the morning, and I love to sit between remote bedding areas. A lot of these stands that I will go into, I haven't sat in since the previous year. Might take a look at them in May, June, clean out a couple sticks here and there. But other than that, really waiting for those calm, cold front conditions. I'm going in. Those are the toe-numbing mornings. And if your toes are numb in the morning like that, and you're wearing some knee boots, and you know it's the right conditions. But those morning cold fronts, whether they're between bedding areas or close to bedding areas, in a long line of deer coming from food, great morning condition. And then on the flip side of that, those are the exact areas you don't want to be in the evening, because all those deer are heading back to the food source. And so again, I rarely sit in a stand all day. I'll take my prime, highly preferred morning stand, and I'll flip back to an evening food stand for the evening, so I can sit in a high value stand the entire day. But those mornings, I think over 80% of my mature bucks have been shot in the morning, and over 80% using the stand for the first time for the year.
Finally, here's Dan Infalt, founder of thehuntingbeast.com and a notorious big buck hunter that has been featured several times in Field & Stream magazine. In this segment, Dan shares his thought process on how to choose a stand setup based on situation.
I mean, it really depends on the terrain I'm in, and if I'm hunting a specific buck. Like if I'm going on a travel trip, like a road trip, let's say hilly country, I'm going to have, in advance before I even go there, I'm going to look at a topo map and pick out the funnels that connect large areas of hills. That would be like a leeward side hillside is where I'm going to expect them to run back and forth to these different areas. But that's totally different than if I'm hunting, say, around home where I know where there's a buck and I'm targeting that animal. I'm going to be targeting him where I think he's going to move. So it's terrain specific and where I'm hunting.
So let's dive in deeper to the first thing you just mentioned there, being terrain. I know that you as you mentioned, you use that a lot in your hunting strategy. Can you give us a little more detail specifically about what terrain features you're looking for during the rut and how you would specifically set up on those?
Okay, hilly country is the easiest in rut for me, because bucks travel the top third of ridges, the top third height. Where they like to walk is where the wind comes over the tops and the thermals come up from the bottom where they meet. There's what I call a wind tunnel, and they can actually smell above and below them by following that ridge line on that side. So that's where they like to cruise. So once you realize that, you can take a topo map and you could just look at the top thirds and mark it up. That's where most of your daylight action is going to be. So now if you take the wind direction and you just look at the leeward sides, you can erase 2/3 of that, and really you got very little left. And it's really easy to narrow down to the exact spots you should be in.
Are you using any type of funnels like saddles or anything to set up on, or is it purely those ridge lines?
I'm usually looking for narrow spots in those ridge lines. What I really like the most is to hunt at the head of a draw. And the reason being is that that cruise line will fluctuate up and down that hill a little bit, and sometimes you're a little off, the buck's below you or he's above you, but you get to the top of one of those draws, and all those trails will come together in a narrow spot.
Okay. Now, how about when it comes to bedding areas? I know you put a premium on hunting bedding areas specifically for bucks, but during the rut, are you still paying as much attention to buck bedding areas, or are you shifting your attention to those doe bedding areas?
Both. Doe bedding areas are very important for cruising bucks, and that's basically what you're taking into consideration
when you're sitting up on those funnels is those bucks are cruising from doe bedding area to doe bedding area and trying to get scent of any does in between, and then they go to doe feeding areas, and they'll skirt the sides of fields or wherever, searching for does. So you're trying to hit them in the funnels. However, and there'd probably be some people that would argue with me on this, but I don't think the biggest bucks, the oldest ones, the more mature ones, cruise as much as those young ones. They might make a mistake or two, but it's usually the 2 and 3 year olds that do all that cruising. But a 3-year-old can be a really big buck. In Wisconsin, that can be a Boone and Crockett easy. But, we're all dreaming of those mature bucks. The biggest bucks I've killed in rut have been in their bedding areas, in the bucks' bedding areas.
When are you getting those bucks when they come back to bed in the morning, or are you getting them just before they take off again in the evening or even midday when they're out cruising for does again?
Well, during the rut, it's a little different than outside of the season. They have rut bedding areas, and if you can figure out where those are, they're usually adjacent to a doe bedding area. Those can be really hot during that time frame, and those bucks tend to get back to the bedding areas even during the rut right at gray light. But they get up in the evening real early, so it's easiest to hit them at the bedding areas in the afternoon.
Well, there you have it. A short but sweet excerpt from the Rules of the Rut 2.0 that hopefully you found just as interesting as I did. If you'd like to hear the rest of this podcast and the other 2 in the series and get the 2 full ebooks included, just visit wiredtohunt.com/rules of the rut. The Rules of the Rut 2.0 package costs $11.99, but as one Wired to Hunt reader, Derek Diaz, announced on Twitter, it is without a doubt the best $12 he's ever spent on hunting gear. Thank you in advance for your support. Proceeds from the Rules of the Rut 2.0 are helping keep the Wired to Hunt podcast on air and a roof over my head, so thank you. Moving on, as always, if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a rating or review on iTunes. We're now officially over 100 reviews, which is awesome, so thanks so much for that. Finally, we'd like to thank our partners who help make this show possible as well. Big thanks to Sitka Gear, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Carbon Express Arrows, Huntsoft, Lacrosse Boots, Big & J Long Range Attractants, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. That all said, thanks so much for joining us today on this bonus episode of the Wired to Hunt podcast. I hope you've been spending some long hours in the tree stand, and maybe even have filled your tag with a big rutting buck. Until next time, hunt hard, have fun, and stay wired to hunt.